As dramatic changes had by now occurred throughout the Beaumont and Port Arthur battle space, as by now all of the PLAN 6th Marine Brigades comprising battalions had all made it ashore an hour prior by 5 a.m., these various battalions of the brigade were by now all conducting either flank clearance operations or capturing already some of the important objectives in this overall operation, as the Air Assault Battalion had by now effectively destroyed the elements of the 1st of the 123rd Marine Battalion, which was a reserve battalion part of the 4th Marine Division, with its Alpha Company, which was a rifle company, and weapons company, heavily dug in requisitioned land from local landowners that were compensated handsomely, as the Marines had effectively tore their land up by digging into it everywhere with trenches and foxholes and even some bunker systems. These forces were effectively annihilated by the air assault forces and their powerful Z9WA attack helo gunships and 82mm mortars, as well, in addition to the potent airstrikes from two Su-34s, which had effectively jettisoned their entire payloads due to the dug-in nature and spread-out nature of these Marine forces, as all the munitions had to be used to effectively cover the entire bivouac site due to how well spread out these forces effectively were. And therefore, the airstrikes, while destroying most of the Marine forces, effectively left a small number that were mopped up by the air assault assets in the area, which had captured this important objective, which was the State Highway 96 bridge in and out of Beaumont, as the rest of the battalion's ground-based forces, which were two air assault infantry companies, also seized and held the vital I-10 bridge to the southwest of the city of Beaumont and had held it against sporadic attacks from armed reactionary civilians in the area. And they soon received heavy artillery support, as the artillery battalion a few hours prior had made it ashore and had already assisted the combat engineer battalion as they were crossing their first proverbial hurdle towards their major objectives inside the city in massive artillery support operations, having had supported them with massed 122mm shell fires into the canal crossing area, as the other side of the canal had effectively been populated by clustering armed reactionary civilians trying to attack the combat engineers crossing one of two bridges left intact from the massed PLAN cruise missile strikes against the majority of local bridges across all the tributaries, which effectively consisted of a large number of canals, rivers, and creeks in the area, leaving very few bridges left for use by the PLAN Marine forces, who would block these areas from defending forces being able to reinforce or retreat, as well as resupply each other, which effectively was out of the question now because they had no communications and no ISR capabilities due to the coalition's anti-satellite and cyber strikes, as well as also the blanketing of local electronic warfare assets, in this case, in this area, in this battle space, coming from the Type 055 Renhai class guided missile cruisers, which were highly advanced weapons platforms, which, as these vessels not only carried a large number of missiles in their vertical launch cells, they also had other weapons capabilities aboard, as well as also electronic attack capabilities, which blanketed most of this battle space, in addition to a PLAN Y9LG electronic warfare / electronic intelligence gathering aircraft that was now orbiting the area, blanketing the rest of the battle space in electronic jamming, as redundant radio and ISR systems like portable radars, which were not in this area as there were no multi-mission radars or air defense radars in this area on the American side, would be jammed by electronic warfare blanketing. And as the radio communications, which were redundant forms of communications, were now gone to the electronic warfare assets, there was effectively no actionable intel by which American forces could act upon, as they could not gather any apart from using foot or vehicle based scouts, which was a very dangerous proposition, as they would always be seen by the iron grip of the coalition's ISR apparatus, which effectively mapped each and every battlefield in real time, plotting enemy and allied positions on the combat data links, which were in each and every vehicle, as well as in the hands in a form of a tablet of each and every squad level NCO and up, including platoon NCOs, company level NCOs, and officers and up, as they could see in real time, where the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which processed all of the ISR data and footage collected and placed friendly and enemy positions by the literal second, including removing them as they were eradicated, destroyed. In this case, more often than not, it was the defending forces that were steadily removed from the combat data links as they were constantly being destroyed by the invading forces, who were in each and every battle space rapidly achieving objectives. And some of the objectives themselves included the absolute and total destruction of the American defending military and paramilitary elements, which were stretched extremely thin all throughout the country, as America only had begun to seriously mobilize due to the Sino-Russian naval drills occurring off of both coasts, which had been going on for some time before the invasion had occurred. It was too little, too late in most cases, and because of the extremely spread out nature of the American forces, they could not defend everything that they had even wanted to defend. Again, they did not know what type of situation might arise, but they never expected it to be the largest ever invasion in all human history. They thought it might be limited, perhaps airstrikes or missile strikes, or perhaps bad actors conducting sabotage operations or small-scale attacks on certain facilities, and therefore they had assumed, and wrongly, that their spread-out forces would be able to handle most of the critical sites to national security. In this case, in the Beaumont-Port Arthur battle space, there were some major national security sites of great importance to the American side, as the port facilities and military installations in the port of Beaumont were absolutely critical to American defense, as these sites were responsible for not only the deployment abroad of many heavy and other types of units, but also the reception of them when they came back, as there were unit rotations occurring in some of America's far-flung commitments. And these sites deployed forces out of Fort Polk, Fort Hood, Fort Bliss, Fort Sill, and others, and received them to send them back by rail, as the rail system in Beaumont was rather extensive for freight rail, and Beaumont's port itself was the fourth largest port in America by tonnage, and most of this was due to the combination of the heavy units coming in and out of the port, as well as also the shipment of oil, as there were major refineries in Beaumont, much like there were in the Houston area, such as in Texas City, Texas, as Exxon had a major footprint in the port in Beaumont, which would be captured by elements of the Combat Engineer Battalion moving in along with the Heavy Combined Arms Battalion to capture the critical objectives, which included the port itself with the oil facilities wanted intact, as well as the port facilities and rail infrastructure wanted intact, even when the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, which was an actual Trojan unit embedded in eastern Texas, fired 4 tactical ballistic missiles of each type of the DF-15B and DF-11A for a total of 8. They had only targeted certain buildings to be destroyed and not the rail or port infrastructure itself, which were one completely intact. Even with destroying some of the buildings, they could easily be replaced, as the coalition would build modular or portable buildings in place of the destroyed structures in the port area. And as the sabotage operation had been a massive success, with Chinese MSS, Pakistani ISI, and also Iranian Ministry of Intelligence agents donning military uniforms and sneaking into these facilities to plant charges on motor pools and on certain buildings, chaos had reigned alongside of the tandem anti-satellite strikes in these facilities. And as there was no actionable intel from the outside of what was going on in the area, many of the forces that had been driven underground by the initial missile strikes remained underground as the artillery battalion was doing a phased advance of its batteries into a new firing position to rain total hell on the city of Beaumont, and the shelling would continue as the battle would continue on, as well as also already having had offered some limited shelling between 5 and 6 a.m. on the forces now mustering together in Vidor of local militia-type forces, as many American militias had formed as a direct response to the immigration crisis, as many even local community watch groups even now form militias because the crime rate had become so high, but these militias were not at all prepared for the type of fight that wouldn't come so much from foreign criminal elements in the country, but would actually come from the foreign Trojan shock armies inside of the nation, as well as the externals smashing across the border to be their heavy-handed reinforcement for the Trojans, that is, as these forces formed tight-knit militia-type forces, especially out of veterans as well as other types of firearm enthusiasts and also other types of personnel coming together in local areas. These militias were effectively not the most common type of armed reactionary civilian element, as most armed reactionary civilians were just simple armed civilians with little to no training, with everything from pistols to hunting rifles to some with sporting rifles and others with shotguns. The shotguns were a wildly terrible weapon for use in this type of operation and conflict. They were not effective at all due to the fact that the enemies they faced were heavily clad in very strong body armor, as well as very adept, capable Kevlars in terms of deflecting certain types of ammunition, as pistol ammunition could, in most cases, be sustained by these Kevlar helmets. Some pistol ammunition was strong enough to penetrate, but the Kevlar itself was made not for ammunition, it was made to stop shrapnel. Although from longer distances, it was possible that even rifle rounds could be deflected if it was a glancing blow on the Kevlar. But the body armor was far stronger than the Kevlar helmets, and the shotgun was a wildly ineffective weapon for this type of combat. It's not only was it a shorter ranged weapon, but most of the types of ammunition the armed civilians had for their shotguns was simply completely inadequate for the type of forces they faced, and would absolutely, of course, be a joke against their vehicles. But the sporting rifles and hunting rifles were by far the best small arms for the armed civilian forces and armed reactionary civilians and regular armed civilians, which the regular armed civilians would later become fighting forces as they would organize into partisan elements. As the smarter, the wiser among the armed civilian populations would flee far away from the initial invasion zones and away from human settlements, and would get out into the wilderness, where they would begin to organize, begin to establish command and control systems and leadership, effective leadership and planning, as well as also actual logistical forces, which they critically needed for long-term sustainable operations, as initially the armed reactionary civilians had no logistical capabilities whatsoever at all, minus the small handful of armed reactionary civilian militia forces, which actually tried to standardize their weapons in terms of certain militias using either AR platforms or Mini 14s, like the Ruger Mini 14s, which all use 5.56 ammunition, making it far easier with standardized weapons to supply one another, as some armed civilians did stockpile ammunition, and this ammunition would be very useful for sustaining long-term defensive operations. Although, again, these forces were few and far between. The majority of armed civilians in the nation were not organized at all and were not part of a militia and were effectively on their own or in very small groups and were easily destroyed by the far more professional and far better trained and far better equipped invasion forces, which easily annihilated these armed civilian forces, especially the armed reactionary civilians who effectively had no idea what they were up against, as they themselves as well had no ISR capabilities and thus no actionable intel by which to coordinate and organize a real effective fight against these forces, and were easily ripped to pieces, as were the military and paramilitary personnel of the Americans, as the main objectives were somewhat concentrated in this particular battle area, as the area of operations of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade effectively necessitated the capture of the Port Arthur port, which had already been achieved immediately in the operation, as well as also the local municipal airport, which had already been achieved, as well as capturing the biggest objectives, which lay in Beaumont, including the port facilities itself, as well as the military sites, and destroying all the defending military forces, which were mostly logistical and support forces, as the only combat forces in the area had been the U.S. Marine Corps companies, the Weapons Company and Alpha Company of the 1st of the 123rd Marines, which had been destroyed immediately by the combination of the air assault forces and powerful Su-34 airstrikes from 2 Su-34 strike aircraft, jettisoning their entire payloads on these forces. Although they were well dug in, they were mostly destroyed in the airstrikes and mopped up by the PLAN Air Assault Battalion assets holding their positions by the 96 Bridge, one of the major crossing points left intact from the PLAN vessel missile strikes, as the large cruise missile barrage had wiped out most of the other bridges across all the major tributaries, rivers, creeks, and canals. And the forces moving in to the city would capture all their major objectives, which also even included this important segment of I-10 which ran through this node. They had to secure it from attacks or counterattacks from American defending forces to enable the externals to move on into the American southeast, where they were needed as heavy-handed reinforcements for Trojans deep inland fighting there, as the external invasion prong, which would effectively be the 16th through 20th Group Armies, would move through this area after they had moved first through the Houston battle space, shedding the 15th Group Army again as reinforcements for the 83rd PLA Group Army to move towards the northeast of Texas after they were relieved after the Houston battle by the 15th Group Army, taking their place as occupation forces in the massive Houston metro area, along with the PAP and 1st PLAN Marine Brigades. The Vidor area, effectively as the recon battalion, was the first to land and conduct recon with quadcopter assets in conjunction with the high altitude and satellite assets. They had moved to destroy a cluster of armed reactionary civilians, around 200 strong, just under that, before the rest of their companies, as 3 companies were left to destroy these elements of recon companies, the rest of their 5 companies had moved into the Vidor/Rose City areas. Rose City was effectively between Vidor itself and Beaumont, but it was mostly a portion of Vidor, effectively. It was immediately adjacent. The one recon company of the 4 companies of recon forces and the headquarters and support company, which was the command and logistical forces of the recon battalion, one company was sent to seize the bridge immediately by 5 a.m., with the other companies establishing a line of contact against the emerging threat of 750 militia-type armed reactionary civilian forces who tried at first to carry out hit-and-run attacks between the 5th and 6th hours, but by hour 6 were now pinned down as they were fixed in place by this fixing attack carried out by the remaining recon companies, as there was a total initially of the 5 companies to arrive, 4 recon companies and the headquarters and support company. 3 had spread out in this area to guard the flanks, the rear flank of this company seizing the bridge, so that if possible, these armed civilians couldn't attack them from behind, as they had established a line of contact inside of Vidor along State Highway 12 and a portion of I-10. As they also fixed these forces in place, these 750 armed reactionary civilians, and guarded the rear flank of this company. The remaining 3 recon companies, catching up after this battle had concluded, would reinforce the company guarding the bridge, making it a total of 4 companies guarding the bridge of recon, 3 companies of recon in the town, plus the headquarters and support company behind these companies guarding the bridge and these companies establishing a line of contact inside of Vidor, with the medium combined arms battalion, after having had secured this large segment of I-10, arriving by 6 a.m., as it was now 6 a.m., in the town of Vidor to outflank these forces moving in from the east, heading west, and would gradually smash these armed reactionary civilian militia forces, although they took cover in everything from storm shelters, the limited number of basements in certain buildings, as well as rubble, to try to take cover not only from the attacks coming from the recon and medium combined arms battalions, but also the increasingly heavier artillery barrage, as the artillery battalion was again making a phased advance, with some batteries remaining here to shell Vidor, while others moved into place to establish a new firing position, with the remaining few batteries eventually packing up and then moving into the same firing position. As batteries moved here and established firing positions and begun to shell major targets, the rest of the batteries would again pack up and move on. As the firing had begun from this new firing point, they could then pack up and move in and join them as firing continued, as forces moved into this area to maintain artillery fire while the movement was occurring to a new firing position along this canal, as they followed behind the combat engineers across the same bridge system that was used by the combat engineers a bit earlier in their battle, as they were heavily supported by the artillery as this was going on, as also some batteries were firing on Vidor from this position and at the 842nd Transport Battalion site. As this was going on at 6 a.m., as the battle ended at 6 along the canal and the advance continued, Heavy Combined Arms Battalion, waiting here, would then join the combat engineers and advance together into the city. Also at 6 a.m. on the northern banks of the Sabine Lake, as the Light Combined Arms Battalion advanced to destroy this grouping of just over 200 armed reactionary civilians, by 6 they were now moving into Orange, again with 3 companies taking the local municipal airport, which would later become a forward operating base, as all these municipal airports in the area would become forward operating bases for the local occupation forces. The headquarters and support company of the Light Combined Arms Battalion, the mortar company, which is the fire support asset of the Light Combined Arms Battalion, and one of the 5 infantry companies would occupy this site, this municipal airport inside of Orange, while the remaining 4 infantry companies would assault and capture the Entergy power plant headquarters, which was absolutely important, including to the running of the power plant itself. For the occupation to come and the colonization operations, they wanted it as much intact as possible, also capturing this vital segment through this node of Orange of I-10 and defending it from assaults from both militia-type armed reactionary civilians mustering together in the countryside and armed civilians inside of Orange that had fled from different parts of the city and come together near I-10 to try to fight back against the attack that was coming from the Light Combined Arms Battalion. With its 4 infantry companies advancing into Orange, 2 would see major combat, with the other 2 taking positions on the edges of the city, one capturing the actual bridge crossing into Louisiana and thus controlling the gateway into the American Southeast, and the other capturing a position just outside of Orange to the west of the city, with, again, the other 2 actually seeing heavy combat inside the city against the armed reactionary civilians that would try to effectively conduct a counterattack of sorts against these forces, as the armed paramilitary elements that were inside of the city as well, numbering 200 of the total of 350 alphabet paramilitary forces, effectively DHS armed elements. There were 200 guarding the Entergy power plant headquarters, with another combined total of armed reactionary civilians effectively being 500, making it a total of 700 armed combatants that had to be overcome in Orange by the Light Combined Arms Battalion's forces, with their last company being the Combat Engineer Company of their Light Combined Arms Battalion, which was effectively an analog to the infantry companies, as it was set up very similar, although instead of having 4 armor personnel carriers, the amphibious armor personnel carrier versions of the ZBDO-5s, they had 3 in each platoon within their combat engineer company, and also 1 GSL-130 armored engineering vehicle, which is a mine clearance vehicle, but also had a plow to plow various obstructions out of the way of the combat engineer forces, as well as their rocket-guided line-clearing charges, which were absolutely devastating to enemy fortifications and minefields, as they could clear paths through minefields with these, as well as also hit enemy fortifications, such as bunkers, as well as also trench systems and sandbag emplacements, and more with these plastic explosive line charges, which were devastating, even on vehicle types as well, certain vehicle types, as they could also, again, plow obstructions and obstacles out of the way. They could also create fighting positions, such as small berms, with their plow, as the combat engineers could both create and destroy obstacles, as these were the ideal force for capturing the Entergy Sabine power plant itself, which by now was extremely lightly guarded, as there were actually more paramilitary forces guarding the Entergy headquarters in Orange than there were the plant itself, as guarding the plant was only just around 150 paramilitary personnel of the DHS. Effectively, they were effectively in military attire and army fatigues with helmets as well issued to them, and body armor in place of their ordinary working clothes, which were khakis and polo shirts. They were now clad in army attire and would be defending the plant with weapons that were passed down to these paramilitary forces through certain government programs that most people are aware of, such as MRAPs, but also issued some heavy weapons like M250 cals, which were effectively a crew serve weapon for their MRAPs, as well as also set up in certain machine gun emplacements that were created with sandbags in the facility itself. As the facility was now cut off from the outside world due to the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, as well as the electronic warfare jamming, there was no contact with any other American forces by the small force defending the power plant. Thus, they had no idea what was about to effectively fall upon them in terms of this invasion force of one combat engineer company out of the Light Combined Arms Battalion being sent to take the power plant, while the rest of the entire battalion effectively took Orange, which was a critical node in this battle overall, as they were in control of the gateway to the American Southeast, which was a separate invasion sector from the South Central invasion sector, as well as control of the Entergy power plant headquarters and the city overall and the airport. This was an important objective to capture in terms of a key node, being Orange. Although it was a smaller city, it was still an important node in this battle, and the Light Combined Arms Battalion would be responsible for its capture and control, as they would have a battle inside of the city itself in the downtown area against the armed reactionary civilians and paramilitary forces, but would have, in lieu of artillery support, heavy air support from the available Su-34 squad of the Su-34 squadron of the Russian VVS that was allocated to this battle space, as there were still plenty of air-to-ground munitions to go around, as each and every Su-34 in this operation carried 26,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, which was slightly more than the Chinese JH-7, which was already a mighty strike aircraft and could carry a massive weight of roughly 20,000 square pounds. The extra 6,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions on each Su-34 made a massive difference. Although two had already expended their munitions and had done an RTB, the remaining 10 aircraft still were relatively heavily laden down with air-to-ground munitions, even after conducting their preliminary strikes and already some close air support operations. Some Su-34s of the squadron had hardly dropped any of their munitions as of yet and would contribute massively to the operation in Orange. There was, of course, the fighter aircraft of the two J-10 squadrons, which were primarily conducting air superiority operations, although by now the USAF and U.S. Naval Aviation Forces and the Marine Corps Aviation Forces throughout the entire nation had been completely and thoroughly annihilated by between 5 and 5:30 a.m. As now there was officially nothing left, these forces would soon conduct an RTB to replace their air-to-air munitions with air-to-ground munitions to be dropped on targets below to support the forces on the ground, as the PLAAF air power in this area was still at this time mostly armed with air-to-air munitions. Each still had a pair of laser-guided precision air-to-ground munitions, 1,000 pounds each, so each aircraft carried 2,000 pounds. And some of the J-10s had already conducted their support strikes on attacking defending forces that were below, as they had already supported operations on the I-10 bridge to the southwest of Beaumont, striking armed reactionary civilians that were trying to attack the two air assault marine infantry companies holding the bridge. And now, on the opposite side of the battle space, the Light Combined Arms Battalion was pressing into the city of Orange in strength and would be supported by powerful airstrikes from Su-34 aircraft, as well as having J-10s on station to offer potent air support below, along with the mighty Su-34 strike aircraft in lieu of artillery, as by now the artillery battalion with its 56 howitzers were mostly focused on the objectives in Beaumont and also suppressing the enemy defending forces in Vidor to support the assault of the elements of the recon battalion, but the entirety of the medium combined arms battalion, with its comprising companies, as they had one company in the medium combined arms battalion of the amphibious assault gun / light tank versions of the ZBDL-5s, as well as having heavy infantry marine companies of amphibious marine infantry that were fully equipped with simply just the infantry fighting vehicle version of the ZBDL-5s, as they did not use the APC versions, which were utilized by the Light Combined Arms Battalion, which was a lighter marine infantry force as a maneuver element, as they only had per platoon in the Light Combined Arms Battalion one ZBDO-5 IFV, with the rest being the APC version with the heavy machine gun turret with a W-85 heavy machine gun. And again, the Combat Engineer Company within Light Combined Arms Battalion was an analog of the infantry companies having the same APCs and one IFV, but in place of a fourth APC, they instead had their armored engineering vehicle in each platoon. As again, the forces defending the Entergy Sabine power plant were totally and completely cut off from the outside world. And prior to the invasion, as the cyber arm of the PLA had gathered enormous intelligence, along with human intelligence gathering in country, as well as also other means of gathering intelligence, had effectively plotted already before the invasion the position of many defending forces, which were constantly monitored through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system as soon as the ISR apparatus moved into place in the invasion. The defending forces, numbering around 150, would be able to be thoroughly and surgically eradicated by the Combat Engineer Company of the Light Combined Arms Battalion. Again, the rest of the battalion moving to Orange at 6 a.m. with a single company from the Light Combined Arms Battalion, the Combat Engineer Company, moving to the Entergy Sabine power plant. This is already after the Medium Combined Arms Battalion had moved into Vidor by 6 a.m., and the Recon Battalion already moved into the Vidor/Beaumont area here, as the Light Combined Arms Battalion moved into Orange and the Entergy Sabine power plant by way of its Combat Engineer Company. They would effectively frown on the use of heavier weapons, as this was to be a surgical operation. The combat engineers would be the absolute best force to carry this operation out, as they had certain weapon systems which could be used in a surgical manner, which included their FPV drones, as their headquarters platoon in the Combat Engineer Company had FPV drone operators. They also had their heavily armed combat robots. They also had the unarmed quad-legged robots, which had arms instead of a heavy machine gun, which could be used to remove obstacles or place obstacles in certain situations, as well as also planting or removing charges or mines. In this instance, they would not use their unarmed quad-legged robots. They would keep them in their vehicles, but they would deploy their armed combat robots, which could get into certain areas where vehicles simply couldn't, whether that was into basements or of buildings, or whether it was onto upper floors of buildings, or into caves or into sewers. These were ideal heavy weapons platforms to support the advance of the combat engineers as they were dismounted from their vehicles and moved against defending enemy forces. As combat engineers deploy these weapons, they would also deploy a small number of the CH-901A loitering munitions, as the FPV drones could destroy heavy vehicles as well as also heavy armored vehicles, as well as also small groups of infantry forces, such as a single squad. The FPV or the loitering munitions vis-a-vis the FPV drones carried larger payloads, and thus the single tube versions of the CH-901As, as the PLAN 6th Marine Brigade did not have the 48 tube TEL system like the PLA Ground Forces or Army had. They used the single tube version, which could also be manually utilized or utilized on the AI target seeking mode, which would be directly influenced by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system through the ISR apparatus, through the data collected. These were a very surgical type of munition, along with the the loitering munitions being equipped with fragmentation rounds to hit clusters of enemy forces without doing damage to the power generating facilities themselves, as again, use of heavy weapons would be highly frowned upon in this operation, although certain exceptions would be made through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system guiding these units, as again, the Entergy Sabine power plant along a lake in the Neches River that emptied out into the Sabine Lake would be assaulted by the combat engineers attacking from three sides, and an airstrike, which would be very limited, with only two 1,000-pounders dropped on the actual campsite that was located between the power generating center and the ancillary buildings in a thickly wooded area, would be carried out by an Su-34 strike aircraft, given the exact coordinates and the strike package in real time through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system to destroy the campsite of the paramilitary forces, which at the moment had 50 of its personnel effectively sitting in as they were taking breaks from shifts and guarding the perimeter. They would be heavily struck by two 1,000-pound munitions, which would be precise and accurate, surgically dropped. Even as powerful as a single 1,000-pounder was, dropping both of these on the campsite would not do any damage to any of the nearby buildings, as they would be far enough away from these strikes to effectively not be affected by them. And thus, the SVP-24 computerized bomb sight on these Su-34s already turned unguided munitions into precision munitions that were almost on par with laser-guided munitions in terms of accuracy, but with the real-time AI battlefield data processing system putting the strike packages together for aircraft, these would be even more accurate. And thus, as they would be dropped on the campsite at the opening of this battle, this would happen in conjunction with the opening attacks by the three combat platoons of the Combat Engineer Company, with the headquarters platoon sitting further back, as these were wetlands such as swamps, as a swamp is a wooded wetland and a marsh is a grassy wetland. This swampy area with this creek, this tributary running through, would be crossed by the combat engineers with ease, as again, their vehicles were amphibious as it stood, and this armed combat robot deployed would assist in laying down suppressing fire against these forces in these sandbag emplacements, as the facility consisted of the main power generating area, the power generating area, and offices and other buildings that were critical to the running of the plant. The ancillary buildings contained even more office-type structures towards the lake, the lake that sat in that was part of the Neches River. It was a reservoir of the Neches River, and these ancillary buildings sat along that area. While this area, the perimeter fencing, would simply be smashed through by these forces coming out of these wooded areas guided through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as all manner and all domains and dimensions of data were crunched and calculated by this system, including traversing through wetlands, wooded areas, giving these forces the best path as the ISR apparatus fed all this data into the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. And the data processing system of the AI also collected terrain data that was also open sourced information about the terrain throughout the nation of America, including which paths were best to take for what forces. And in this case, the wetlands proved not to be an issue for the combat engineers, as they were amphibious forces, as they were part of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade anyway. And as these forces attacked the facility on three sides, the tactical L-vectoring fire, initially opening up this operation in two sides, would be a tactical masterstroke, as the fields of fire were mutually supporting in a general L vector of fire against these forces, and all of it was very surgical. The real-time AI battlefield data processing system even guiding these forces on what weapons to use and when, in accordance with preserving these buildings, as well as also preserving one another, preventing friendly fire incidences, as angle and traverse of weapons and what type of weapons were effectively advised through this system and when to use them. And this prevented needless friendly fire casualties amid these forces, as well as also preventing the destruction of this vital power generating area of the plant. As each platoon moving in on these different sides with their infantry fighting vehicles, ZBD-05 in each platoon having one, as well as also their three amphibious armor personnel carrier versions of the ZBD-05 with their heavy machine gun turret with a W-85 heavy 12.7mm machine gun, as well as their armored engineering vehicle, the GSL-130. The armored engineering vehicles could utilize their rocket-guided line-clearing charges relatively liberally, with the exception of as they effectively entered the plant, as this could potentially pose a risk to the plant itself, and thus these were used from further distances, and the calculations were precise on the use of these rocket-guided line-clearing charges, every bit as much as they were for everything from artillery to airstrikes and even missile strikes from the sea. As they moved in their armored engineering vehicles, rocket-guided line-clearing charges destroyed not just the perimeter fencing, which could easily be smashed through anyway, as it was chain-link fencing with concertina wire. They destroyed this segment of fencing along with these two security vehicles belonging to the ordinary plant security personnel, who by now had fled from their duties and left the plant as soon as the massive explosions throughout this battle space had been heard by everybody in this facility. Again, they had no contact or communications with outside friendly forces, and thus they were left to effectively be surprised by this incoming attack hours into the invasion, as they had sat and heard everything from the cruise missile barrages launched from the sea to the enormity of the airstrikes carried out by the air power in this operation, to the artillery fire coming in massive barrages. These forces were terrified and clung to their sandbag emplacements throughout the facility, and heavy suppressing fire would be laid down on these forces by the PLAN Marines as they advanced into the facility to begin to clear it of all enemy defending forces. As this platoon, and this platoon moved in, many of the actions carried out by these forces would occur nearly or at the same time, so covering this operation in any coherent, rational order will be difficult, but as always, it will be attempted. As the loitering munitions entered the operation, one would strike these forces on the corner with a fragmentation warhead, and thus not doing any real damage other than simple cosmetic damage to this part of the power generating facility, this building here, while the other loitering munition moving in would circle the battle space looking for targets of critical importance, such as personnel taking position on higher ground, such as on top of or in the windows of buildings, and eventually seeing none, would be utilized to assist in destroying these forces, acting as a QRF force, as the squad moving between these two power-generating buildings would move to try to support these forces as they were being slaughtered in their sandbag emplacements, including having M250 cals in behind this sandbag emplacement, in this one, and in this one. The rocket-guided line-clearing charge fired by this platoon's GSL-130 would simply annihilate much of the sandbag emplacements that were here and here, destroying the personnel and the M250 cal and its users in this sandbag emplacement, as part of the sandbags would still be intact, as most of the destruction was over here. It was fired just far away enough to where it didn't do any real damage to these buildings, again, apart from some cosmetic damage from the blast. But also there were FPV drones in the area as well to assist in destroying the MRAPs, as again, massive intelligence had been gathered before this operation even unfolded on the defending forces, including even before the invasion. So it was already known that there was a light defensive force in this area, and as the ISR apparatus went up, as the invasion begun, they were constantly monitored in real time. And thus when these forces came in, it was a total surprise as they came out of the wooded areas and swamps and attacked in force, as again, the wetlands were no real obstacle for these forces as long as there were paths through them, as they were amphibious anyway. And they destroyed these two security vehicles, while all of these forces were in a double column rolling shield of this platoon in terms of their tactical formations, as the fire coming at them from these sandbag emplacements would simply fall upon the vehicles and do virtually nothing to them except for maybe scratching the paint. The same would be the case against this platoon, while this platoon to the southwest would remain mounted in their vehicles, including two of the armed combat robots of the entire company in these vehicles with the troops. And as they moved and smashed through the fencing, the GSL-130 armored engineering vehicle, simply plowing through it, would fire a rocket-guided line-clearing charge at this portion of the sandbag emplacements, along with an FPV drone slamming into this MRAP, blasting personnel and sandbags and the MRAP to pieces along with the FPV drone, and thus would then continue moving, being fired at by these forces and by this MRAP coming around the corner, as they had staggered weapons as the follow-up vehicles, the infantry fighting vehicle, the ZBDO-5 IFVs, and the three amphibious APCs, the ZBDO-5 APC versions, would have staggered weapons, and the IFV locking on to this MRAP coming through this dirt path, as this was a dirt path that connected to asphalt on this road through the plant and around this building, coming around on a patrol as the attack had begun, would be locked onto and destroyed by powerful 30mm autocannon fire with HE armor-piercing ammunition, which would shred this MRAP and its occupants to simple pieces, as the blasts and the armor-piercing capabilities of the rounds simply annihilated this MRAP as it came around the corner. As they then continued to advance and continued taking some fire from a few survivors, they simply wiped them out with heavy machine gun fire and annihilated them. As this was happening, all of these vehicles from this platoon and this platoon were simultaneously moving through and smashing their way into the facility, including these armed combat robots. They were all laying down fire, as they were all taking fire, as the green indicates. They were taking fire as they emerged from these wooded areas and swamps, including initially smashing through the fence, taking fire from these forces until this slammed into the forces on the corner. And the other one, again, would help out with this QRF-type force moving through these power-generating buildings as they tried to respond to the advance of these forces, smashing their way into the facility as this rocket-guided line-clearing charge annihilated these forces. This armored engineering vehicle, this GSL-130, smashed through the fencing with their forces in a double-column rolling shield behind it, who would be then deployed from out from behind their vehicle into the remaining sandbags to take position to lay down fire against these forces over here, along with this squad emerging from behind this armored personnel carrier, and would get a lock with one of their anti-tank weapons being an HJ-08, which would strike this vehicle along with an FPV drone as well. And another FPV drone would fly and hit this MRAP as it came around the corner, surgically annihilating these vehicles as they crashed down onto their roof and destroyed them and the occupants inside. As an HJ-08 and an FPV drone also hit this MRAP, it was destroyed, with an FPV drone hitting this one and destroying it. All of this surgically carried out by the FPV drone operators in the headquarters platoon, supporting their combat troops, their combat marines of the company, of this amphibious PLAN Marine Combat Engineer Company moving into this facility. As there were more FPV drones throughout the area, they too would help in the destruction of these forces, along with fire from the infantry fighting vehicle, simply shredding through these MRAPs, and also an FPV drone hitting one of the MRAPs, along with the rocket-guided line-clearing charge from the GSL-130 hitting them as well, simply blasting all of this into pieces, these vehicles and forces in the immediate vicinity, as another FPV drone would hit as the heavy machine gun fire was causing them to keep their heads down in their sandbag positions, much like this paramilitary operative behind these sandbags, as one of his comrades had been cut down by small arms fire trying to get to another sandbag emplacement, while 50 cal fire was hitting the side of this APC vehicle, causing small damage, but would have heavy return fire meted out to cause them to be suppressed and therefore be able to be advanced upon within grenade range, or even have 35mm grenades fired into their emplacement, or other types of weapons like an FPV drone coming down and crashing into them. All of these different systems deployed all had very surgical effects, while only causing limited cosmetic damage to the buildings themselves, as the crossfire, of course, would cause bullet holes and chunks of building material to come out of the buildings. This could all be fixed later down the road, as this plant, again, would be occupied by technicians and engineers of the coalition of the Chinese, as their colonization efforts would move forward, and this plant eventually would be restored along with power to the country, as the effects of the cyber attack would be undone by the Chinese after the invasion. As now, the armored personnel carrier and infantry fighting vehicles smashed through the fencing here and here. The squad, the double column rolling shield, would deploy from out behind and effectively help finish after these forces were finished off by the heavy fire of the IFV and this APC laying down heavy machine gun fire. As the IFV fired 30mm autocannon fire into the sandbags and blasted them away, they moved, smashed through the fence into this area. One squad would deploy around some of the remaining sandbags that were still in place and keep their heads low, while the IFV moved into place and then shifted position and moved this way to lay down suppressing fire against these forces, with their squad moving out from behind them and laying down fire on the flanks of these forces, these two half squads, while this squad moved out from over the sandbags and laid down fire, and then bounded and covered tactically towards these sandbags and threw a grenade over here as they were in grenade range and finished off the rest of these forces. Before then, they moved in and cleared this large power generating building. As that was happening, as these vehicles had smashed through the limited remaining sandbags, they had moved into position here and then shifted position here as the vehicles spread out of this platoon of 5 vehicles and faced this direction as these forces moved in to clear this building, as this is part of standard building clearance protocol and procedures to effectively have vehicles and or troops outside of a building, because the vehicles could either provide fire support for the troops as they entered the building, looking at higher windows and other areas to provide cover for the forces moving into a building, or they could block escapes from personnel, of enemy personnel possibly fleeing the building, either vehicles or troops, or they could have the troops, if there were troops, go in to as reinforcements, besides cutting off escape, providing fire support, or guarding flanks. In this case, they were guarding flanks facing this direction as they spread out here, as these forces moved and cleared this building, as they came out from behind this APC, an infantry fighting vehicle from this platoon. As this was going on, at the same time as the armored engineering vehicle smashed through this area, they deployed their squad to effectively take position here and then here to have a field of fire facing this direction as the squads from this platoon, as their IFVs were laying down fire as they moved towards this area, and one of the FPV drones hit these forces as the armed combat robot from this platoon moved into place, laying down fire into their rear flank. They eventually moved into place, deployed their squads from out behind them. They already destroyed this vehicle, this MRAP, this Max Pro MRAP, with infantry fighting vehicle fire, which shredded it to pieces with 30mm fire, before they then deployed their troops to finish off these forces. As you can see, they were still taking some fire from some survivors, but then they finished them off with the IFE and this APC, and then the troops as well, coming out from behind their vehicles and laying down fire here in wedge formations at these forces. And as these forces moved into place as a QRF force, they would not only be attacked by this wedge firing into them and throwing a grenade, but also by the remaining circling CH-901A with a fragmentation warhead, which would do virtually no real damage to these power generating facilities and strike and destroy these forces in tandem with the fire coming from the squad that was dismounted. Then this squad would move around, take position here in a wedge to have fields of fire facing this direction, while these forces bounded and covered. After finishing off these forces, they bounded and covered tactically through the area to clear the buildings in the area, including this power generating building. After clearing the smaller building, they would join them. As this was going on, again, over here, you had the squad from behind this armored engineering vehicle taking position around this gas tank, this large gas cylinder tank, then moving in to place to take this building, as these vehicles from this platoon, having had watched this area, now bent around this office building on this concrete area here and faced the ancillary structures and the destroyed campsite area to provide not only fire support from the vehicles facing this direction while the troops cleared these buildings, but also had their troops and armed combat robots still mounted up inside that could be deployed instantly to support the forces clearing the buildings if necessary. As now the different platoons, having it stormed the power plant, were all working in tandem together in a tactical masterstroke to clear the entire facility of all defending forces and effectively seize control of it intact and be able to get it up and running when the time came. They would continually occupy their positions after capturing this facility for the remainder of the invasion, as this combat engineer company would set up their own defenses around the perimeter and defend these buildings from any conceivable counterattack, which would never come, because by then the entire battle space would effectively be eradicated of enemies, at least for a time. But for now, as these forces face this direction, the squads from this platoon and this platoon were busily clearing these buildings as they had finished off these forces, as this force had again been struck by a fragmentation warhead CH-901A. They were all wiped out. They entered this building, large building in the power generating area, to clear it. As these forces had moved in earlier, they were wiped out by the IFV and heavy machine gun fire from the CBD-05 IFV of the platoon, as well as the heavy machine gun fire from the APC versions of the CBD-05s in that platoon. As that QRF force had been quickly wiped out, they were no longer a threat as these forces were moving into the building at the time the vehicles were here. And then as they bent around to face this way, this force, with a field of fire facing this way, no longer had to orient fire in this direction because the vehicles had it covered. And then they moved in to clear this building and then clear this office building in this area. While these forces were clearing this building, they then moved to clear the final power generating building in this area. As these forces had moved in and finished these personnel off on the perimeter area, including with their armed combat robot firing into the rear and an FPV drone strike, they then deployed their two squads from these two APCs into this building here on the campus to clear it, as the armed combat robot moved in to guard their flanks, as these forces again had tactically bounded and covered, leapfrogging towards their objectives to clear, they cleared these buildings and then moved into this building, while the vehicles here from this platoon with troops and bots mounted up facing this direction to give them cover. As that was happening, as these forces were clearing these buildings on site, the forces on this side of this platoon, having had taken a position here, would continue to maintain a field of fire facing this direction with this particular squad from behind this armored engineering vehicle that had moved into place here. This squad, having had laid down fire against these forces earlier, including with an ATGM, an HJ-08, which was effectively frowned upon but was sanctioned for use on this MRAP so as not to allow it to lay down fire and wipe this squad out with their heavy machine gun, as their fire had been currently oriented towards the APC moving into place in the area. They got the lock with their HJ-08 and destroyed it, along with, of course, FPV drone strikes as well on this MRAP coming around the corner, as well as also another one hitting this MRAP at the same time as the HJ-08, and one destroying this MRAP to effectively protect the bots from destruction, because they were starting to take some heavy fire from the M250 cal, which would have destroyed them had the fire been more effective, but they were destroyed quickly and weren't able to lay down the requisite amount of firepower on these bots to finish them off. And they continued their advance and were laying down fire as they moved towards this vehicle, and this vehicle was then destroyed as they were at this position here. Then, as these forces were clearing the area, they had a field of fire facing this direction and would move here temporarily, while these two squads from behind the armored engine, or behind this APC and this APC here, were moving over the sandbags and around this area to clear this building. As this wooded area and this wooded area and these remaining wooded areas that weren't destroyed by this strike here effectively blocked view from this building, the ISR assets had seen earlier as the fighting begun and this strike on this camp had begun, from some of the buildings further out and just off this map, there had been 30 security personnel of the paramilitary forces that had emerged in and had moved into this building from other positions, and they effectively were the last remaining forces to contend with for control of this facility, because the rest of their forces guarding the perimeter around the most important part of the power plant, the power generating area, as this was a gas-burning power plant, they had all been wiped out along the perimeter, including the QRF forces and the patrol forces of MRAPs that effectively were on driving patrols around the perimeter, as again, the main security forces of the plant itself had long since fled, along with the technicians and engineers trying to get home, finding often that they either had no home or they had no way to get there effectively and were stuck due to the combat unfolding all throughout the battle space. We're all effectively gone at this point, and even with the security personnel abandoning vehicles like these two security trucks, which were destroyed early on as there were no actual security personnel in them, the only personnel left defending the plant were the DHS personnel, and they had been gradually annihilated by the PLAN Marine forces, as they stood no chance against this type of firepower, including the FPV drones, even the few loitering munitions used, as well as the armed combat robots, and most of all, the vehicle-based firepower and firepower of the actual combat engineers themselves, as the dismounts carried considerable firepower, not just with their rifles, but with their light machine gun as well, or light machine guns, as well as also their hand grenades, 35 millimeter tube fired grenades, as each squad had a 35 millimeter grenade tube operator, as his rifle carried a tube of such, as well as also even other types of equipment, as they now smashed through the area and had gradually wiped out all of the defending perimeter forces, including here. Before they wiped these forces out, they finished off these half squads before they took this building. All of the perimeter forces, including the patrol elements, were completely and totally eradicated. And as the 30 personnel moved into this area, as these buildings were being cleared, these final buildings, the platoon, with all of its personnel mounted facing this direction, would now move towards these buildings through these wooded areas, which are now basically stumps and splinters after the 2,000-pound airstrike in this area, with 2,000 pounds of munitions dropped by this single Su-34 strike. at the opening of the battle at the same time as these forces were smashing through the perimeter fencing, laying down fire as they moved toward it. The FPV drones in this area would effectively fly into a few of the windows and destroy a few of the personnel, as the personnel were scattered throughout this building as this platoon moved in. But fire would begin to come out of the windows as they got closer, as the 5 vehicles of the platoon would take fire, but they would lay down suppressing fire toward the windows, especially with the heavy machine guns aboard the ZBD-05 armor personnel carrier versions, because they did not want to use the more powerful firepower of the infantry fighting vehicle, as the infantry fighting vehicle version had the 30mm autocannon plus a 12.7mm heavy machine gun, which they used to return fire at the elements in the windows. But they also had an ATGM rail mounted on the side, a shorter range HJ-73C, which was absolutely devastating against armored vehicles and light bunkers. But that, of course, would not be used in this operation, as it was highly frowned upon. Neither would the rocket-propelled grenades, which were carried by these combat engineers, and only one HJ-08 ATGM was used because the real-time AI battlefield data processing system had sanctioned its use in a certain situation to prevent the possible annihilation of a whole squad of engineers. Fortunately for the combat engineers, they would only have 10 wounded, and many of them minor wounds. Only 2 would be somewhat serious, as bones would be shattered in their extremities from 5.56 ammunition. Most of them had flesh wounds in their extremities, as their body armor easily could handle strikes from 5.56 ammunition. They effectively had a near flawless operation to capture the Entergy Sabine power plant intact, as they now had their final operation to eradicate the defenders. This platoon that had attacked originally from the southwest direction, as if one were to look at a map of this plant, this 1 by 1 mile area contained the main power generating area, which effectively was the gas burning power plant and its ancillary facilities that were a bit beyond this area. They would be cleared by this platoon, because after they would finish off the remaining defenders, they would conduct a patrol of their own to ensure there were no holdouts in the rest of the facility, but they would find none, as the main fighting happened in this area. As the armed combat robots now moved around this thickly wooded area, as this plant was built amid a heavily wooded area, they moved around this area and begun to lay down fire into some of the windows of this building, as they had taken some fire from the windows, but they would wipe out a few of the personnel that had fired out at these robots. As they held a position here, these 2 robots, this platoon would dismount both of its combat robots, one facing this direction and one facing this direction, and they would have an L-vectored field of fire, not just to prevent escape from the other side of the building from one of the 2 combat robots facing this way. The other would face this way, and one would face this way from this platoon, with another combat robot dismounted at the front to watch the front, along with one of the 5 squads of the combat engineers, effectively coming from the GSL-130 armored engineering vehicle, while the IFV of the platoon and the 3 APCs would dismount all of their squads as well. They would have 2 squads breach this building and conduct building clearance operations, as the bots would effectively guard the rear exit, cover this side as well. One bot faced this way, one faced this way, and the other of these 2 faced behind the building. The 2 squads would breach, as they took some fire from the windows as they breached, as well as also the vehicles taking fire, but they returned heavy suppressing fire as these 2 squads came out from the remaining 2 APCs and cleared this building, which was empty of defenders. The squads methodically went through this building, clearing every single office, hallway, closet, everything, and caused 5 out of the 30 defenders to flee out this exit, only to be cut down by the crossfire of 12.7mm heavy machine gun fire from these armed combat robots. As they slaughtered these 5 trying to flee from the building as these forces entered, they cut them down completely, and the remaining defenders that had not gone to the windows and been cut down at the windows were trying to put up fights from inside of the rooms. Many of them did not want to live a life in the captivity of the Chinese, and thus opted to fight to the very end. Although only several would surrender, the rest would be brutally annihilated as the PLAN Marine squads had gone from hallway to hallway, room to room, just cutting down the forces as they tried to put up a fight against them. And most of these paramilitary forces were in no position to put up any effective resistance, as their weapons options were somewhat more limited than the military forces, as again, a military force or even a paramilitary force only fights as good as its training, and the PLAN Marines were far better trained than the American paramilitary elements, and they simply slaughtered them. It was barely a competition between these two types of forces. As they had cleared this office building, they would then eventually mount up and again conduct a final patrol around the facility, checking each and every building on the western end of it. Finding no holdouts or defenders, the entire area would be declared cleared by this company, who would then establish their own positions and defenses around this plant and would hold it for the remainder of the invasion until the occupation officially begun, and the area would again be populated by technicians and engineers from China to operate the plant when it would come back online, as well as these forces being relieved and replaced by another force in terms of these PLAN Marine Combat Engineers from the Light Combined Arms Battalion, who now occupied this area, with the rest of their battalion at the same time pressing into Orange, as this battle would be relatively intense, especially for the armed reactionary civilians and the remaining paramilitary forces occupying the Entergy power plant headquarters. They would be brutally annihilated by the forces of the PLA's Light Combined Arms Battalion, who would fight a heavily determined battle, as they were determined to take and clear the entirety of Orange, as this was a critical node in this operation, and the 6 PLAN Marine Brigades command elements were depending on this maneuver element to do the job, just as they depended on the combat engineers of this battalion to do the job of capturing and securing the power plant intact and surgically removing the defenders, which they were able to do, and they were the perfect force for this because they had the perfect tools available to do this. The combat within the downtown area of Orange would be heavy and savage, and the airstrikes would be brutally punishing, carried out by the Su-34s, conducting close air support strikes for the advancing Marine infantry forces of the Light Combined Arms Battalion. As these forces would move into Orange, they too would lay down heavy fire from their vehicles and their combat troops, as the infantry forces were also the perfect force for this particular operation, as they were effectively heavily armed and easily able to dispatch the defending forces that were being thrown at them effectively. As they would move into the city of Orange, much like the Combat Engineer Battalion and Heavy Combined Arms Battalion moving into the city of Beaumont, the resistance from the armed reactionary civilians at first would be small attempted hit-and-run attacks, which would mostly fail, but as they would move into Orange a bit deeper, armed reactionary civilians would be fleeing to the north of the city near I-10, while others, such as the militia-type forces, as a grouping of just over 200 would be moving into Orange from north of it, would come together around I-10 and put up determined resistance, although they would be, again, struck by massive Su-34 airstrikes, as well as also mortar strikes from the 82mm Mortar Company, now at the Orange Airport and within range from the municipal airport to support the advance of their 4 infantry companies moving into Orange, they would be hit heavily by 82 millimeter mortars and the massive Su-34 strikes, which would wipe out many buildings in their wake, as well as many personnel as well. As the armed reactionary civilians, along with paramilitary forces defending the actual Entergy power plant headquarters, would be brutally slaughtered by the invading forces moving into the area. This, of course, the advance into the city of Orange occurring at the same exact timing as the Entergy Sabine power plant was being captured, as that combat initiated at 6 a.m., as did the advance into Orange and the battle for the small city of Orange itself by the Light Combined Arms Battalion's infantry companies moving into the area. Again, the artillery of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as its artillery battalion, was mostly providing its massive fire support to the forces now fighting in the Vidor area, as well as also in Beaumont, including now beginning to provide fire support to the 2 air assault Marine infantry companies defending the bridge of I-10 to the southwest of the city. Artillery would not be able to support the operations in the city of Orange, and thus the air power would be used in lieu of this instead. And again, this would be massive and devastating firepower for sure in this operation, as thousands of pounds of air-to-ground munitions would be dropped on the defending forces and effectively wipe them off the face of the earth. As the Light Combined Arms Battalion's Marines press towards their objectives and ultimately would clear their objectives using their vehicles and dismounted firepower backed up by 82 millimeter mortar fire, and again, the potent airstrikes of the available air power in the area, as there was quite a miniature armada operating over this battle space for sure in terms of an air armada. The remaining firepower aboard these aircraft was still substantial at this point in time and contribute massively to the operations unfolding below in Orange and even elsewhere in the battle space. These aircraft being absolutely devastating in terms of the thousands of pounds of munitions that remained aboard and able to be used on ground targets below. As the Combat Engineer Battalion and Heavy Combined Arms Battalions pressed into the city of Beaumont itself, they would begin to move on their major objectives of the operation within the city, including the entire port area with all of its military sites, including even the headquarters of the U.S. Military Sealift Command, as well as moving into downtown and first eradicating the sizable American logistical forces in the U.S. Army Reserve Station that was in the downtown area, as again, the 377th, the 842nd, and 596 Transport Group, in terms of the battalion-sized forces, had all been mobilized to their fullest extent as reserve elements and were populating these areas to man them as their stations. Because again, they did not expect such a powerful, massive, all-encompassing nationwide invasion to fall upon them. They had expected more small-scale attacks, such as those that had occurred right before the invasion had kicked off with the Chinese MSS, Pakistani ISI, and Iranian Ministry of Intelligence agents conducting sabotage operations. Now, they expected things like that, but they were unable to respond because these agents had carried out their sabotage operations in a flawless manner, as the American forces had become somewhat complacent, although they were told to be on the lookout for any and everything suspicious. But the operation had been carried out exceedingly well and successfully, and had caused the maximum amount of chaos at the same time as the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes. Mostly the operation was that successful because of the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and the blanketing of electronic warfare jamming assets, which effectively hampered and ruined the communications of the American forces, and thus they were unable to effectively respond to the sabotage, as well as also the oncoming invasion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade, as cruise missile strikes had begun to take out bridges, and limited air and tactical ballistic missile strikes had begun to hit certain targets in the area before being joined by massive concentrated artillery barrages from the 56 howitzers comprising the battalion of the 6th PLAN Marine Brigade's artillery. These PLZ-07 122mm howitzers, when fired en masse in concentrated form, were still very destructive artillery systems and caused enormous destruction in their wake in support of their maneuver forces, as the light, medium, and heavy combined arms battalions, the combat engineer battalion as well, and even could it be included the air assault forces, were all receiving one form of support or another, with the medium, the heavy combined arms battalions as well, and the combat engineer battalion, even parts of the air assault battalion, were all receiving artillery support. Even the reconnaissance battalion's elements now in Vidor, as the recon battalion was split between Vidor itself and Rose City, where the I-10 bridge crossing in and out of Beaumont was, to the east of Beaumont. They too were receiving potent artillery fire support. As the light combined arms battalion would receive mighty air support, they would take their objectives in Orange successfully, which will be covered in the next video installation, this hypothetical invasion documentary series, highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines through the lens of a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, utilizing real-world everything. More to come next.